Okay, so you want to buy a security company, some uniforms, hire some guards, put them outside buildings, and collect a check every month. Simple business, simple math. You're basically renting out human beings by the hour, and everyone needs protection, so the demand never really goes away. The private security industry in the United States alone employs close to 1 million guards, spread across more than 100,000 separate companies. Globally, the industry is worth well over $185 billion. That is not a typo, and that is not a niche market. That is bigger than movie theaters, bigger than gyms, bigger than the entire domestic airline catering business combined. So here's the question that should be bothering you before you write a single check. If demand for private security keeps climbing every single year, in every single country, in every single recession, why do so many of these companies barely survive? Why do so many of them go bankrupt with contracts worth millions of dollars sitting right there on their books? Let's find out where all that money actually goes. Picture this. You just won a contract with a large corporate client, a distribution warehouse, say, or a corporate headquarters. The contract is worth more than $1 million a year. That's real money. That's the kind of number that makes you want to frame the signature page and hang it on your office wall. Here's the part nobody tells you when you're staring at that number. Winning that contract almost never happened because you were the best option on the table. It happened because you were the cheapest one by a hair. Most of these contracts are won through a bidding process where the difference between the winning bid and the next one down is only 1 to 3%. 3%. That's the entire margin you fought for. And you haven't even hired your first guard yet. So the contract is worth a fortune on paper. But you already gave away your safety cushion just to get your name on the page. Now let's see what happens to the money once it actually starts flowing in. Here's the naive assumption. A client pays you $35 an hour for a guard. You pay that guard, say, $20 an hour. $15 left over. Easy money, right? Wrong. Almost all of it disappears before it ever reaches your bank account. Start with the guard's wage itself. Say you're paying $20 an hour, which is roughly the going rate for an unarmed guard in a mid-sized American city today. That $20 is not what it costs you. On top of that wage, the law requires you to pay payroll taxes, roughly 7.5%, then state and federal unemployment insurance, another 3% or so. Then, and this is the big one, workers' compensation insurance, which for a physically confrontational job like security can run 18% or higher. Add all of that on top of the base wage, and a $20 an hour guard actually costs you almost $26 an hour before they've swept a single parking lot. That is money you owe regardless of whether the client's happy, regardless of whether there's an incident, regardless of anything at all. Now stack the rest of the costs on top. Uniforms, radios, licensing fees, because in most states a guard needs a state license, and so does your company. General liability insurance, which for this industry is expensive precisely because guards are physically present during dangerous situations. Back office staff to handle scheduling and payroll. GPS patrol software so clients can verify guards actually walked their routes. Marketing and the cost of writing proposals for the next contract, because you're always chasing the next one. By the time all of that is subtracted from a $35 an hour bill rate, what's actually left over as pure operating profit is somewhere between $2 and $4 an hour. $2 to $4 out of 35. That's your slice, on a job where you're the one carrying all the legal risk if something goes wrong tonight. Now here's a detail that sounds boring but has bankrupted more security companies than almost anything else on this list. Your guards are hourly employees. By law, you have to pay them every week, sometimes every 2 weeks. There's no negotiating that. It's not optional. Your client, on the other hand, is a large corporation or a government agency. And large corporations and government agencies do not pay their bills quickly. Standard payment terms in this industry run 60 to 90 days after you send the invoice. So walk through what that actually means. You sign a contract for 10 guards. You start paying those 10 guards every single week. 60 days go by. That's roughly $60,000 in wages you've already paid out of your own pocket, and you haven't received a single dollar from the client yet. Where does that $60,000 come from while you wait? Most companies don't have it sitting around. So they borrow against the invoice itself through something called factoring, which basically means a lender advances you cash against the invoice you're owed and takes a cut for doing it. That's an interest cost, layered on top of a business that was already only making $2 to $4 an hour in profit. This is why a security company can look completely healthy on paper, showing $1 million a year in contracts, and still be constantly scrambling to make payroll. The revenue is real. The cash isn't there yet. And payroll doesn't wait for accounts receivable. So if the margins are already this thin, Why would any sane business owner bid even lower? Because of how these contracts get awarded in the first place. Most corporate and government security contracts go through a formal bidding process. And in the vast majority of cases, the client picks the lowest bid that technically meets the requirements. Not the best guards. Not the most experienced supervisors. The lowest number on the page, that pushes companies to submit bids they privately know are unsustainable, on the theory that they'll make the money back later, either by charging premium rates for emergency coverage or by raising prices once the client renews the contract and has grown dependent on them. Sometimes that works. A lot of the time it doesn't, because one aggressive new competitor entering a city can reset the entire local pricing structure within a matter of months. And now everyone else is stuck matching a price nobody can actually survive on. The company that wins the contract at the lowest price doesn't inherit the best deal. It inherits the least room for error. And error is where this business actually falls apart. Here's the problem with a company built entirely on physical human presence. If one guard doesn't show up for their shift, you can't just shrug it off. You have a legal and contractual obligation to have a body standing in that spot. So what happens? The supervisor scrambles. Maybe they ask the outgoing guard to stay for a second shift. Maybe they call someone in on overtime. Either way, that replacement labor typically costs 1.5 to 2 times the normal wage. Remember, your entire operating profit on that shift was $2 to $4 an hour. One overtime shift and that profit is not just gone, it's negative. You lost money covering that one post for one night. Now multiply that by the holidays, when almost every guard wants time off, and you have to pay a premium just to get anyone to show up at all. Holiday staffing alone can wipe out weeks of accumulated profit across an entire company. And this is before anything actually goes wrong on site. Say a warehouse gets broken into on a night when the post was short-staffed, or covered by a guard on their second exhausted shift in a row. Modern patrol software uses GPS to log exactly when and where a guard walked their route. In a lawsuit, that log becomes evidence. If it shows a gap, a missed patrol, an unaccounted for hour, that gap is no longer just an operational embarrassment. It's an exhibit in a courtroom. The obvious response to all this chaos is to just hire more guards, build a bigger bench, stop scrambling every time someone calls in sick. Here's the problem. Hiring in this industry is brutally inefficient. To find one guard who can actually pass a criminal background check, a drug screening, and state licensing requirements, a company typically has to process dozens of applicants. And once you do hire someone, the odds that they'll still be there a year from now are not good. Annual turnover in this industry regularly runs above 100%, and in some markets it's been measured well above that, meaning some companies effectively have to replace their entire workforce more than once every 12 months. Every single one of those hires costs money before they generate a single dollar of billable revenue. Background checks, drug tests, uniforms, state licensing fees, paid training hours where the new guard isn't earning the company anything yet. If that guard quits after 90 days, which happens constantly, none of that upfront cost ever gets recovered. So a company that wins a big new contract and rushes to staff it up can actually burn through cash faster than the contract brings money in. Because the hiring costs hit immediately, and the contract's thin profit trickles in slowly, 60 to 90 days late, as we already covered. Given everything you've just heard, you'd be forgiven for wondering if anyone makes real money in private security at all. Some companies do, and it's worth understanding exactly how, because it's almost a completely different business model wearing the same name. The companies with the healthiest margins aren't the ones with the most guards walking around. They're the ones that have shifted toward technology. Remote video monitoring, camera networks watched from a centralized control room, sometimes covering dozens of properties from a single office, using software that flags suspicious movement so a human only has to look at the moments that actually matter. The financial difference between these two models is enormous. A traditional guarding company typically runs an operating profit margin after everything of somewhere between 5 and 7%. A technology-driven monitoring company can run operating margins above 30%. That's roughly 4 to 6 times more profitable on the exact same core promise of keeping a property safe. Why such a massive gap? Because remote monitoring breaks the link between revenue and headcount. A guarding company that wants to double its revenue has to roughly double its workforce, along with every single cost tied to that workforce we just walked through. A monitoring company that wants to double its revenue mostly needs more cameras and more software licenses, not proportionally more staff. That's also why these technology-focused companies tend to sell for far higher prices when they're bought or sold. Investors will pay 12 to 16 times a monitoring company's annual earnings, compared to only 4 to 6 times earnings for a traditional guarding company. The market itself is telling you which version of this business it trusts more. Here's the risk that sits above everything else we've discussed, and it's the one that has genuinely destroyed companies overnight. It's called negligent hiring liability, and it works like this. If a security guard commits an act of violence, or a sexual assault, or serious negligence while on duty, the company that hired that guard can be sued directly, not just the individual. Courts look at what the company actually knew about that guard's background, and just as importantly, what the company should have known if it had done a proper screening. Let's use a real documented example, because this isn't hypothetical. A jury in Missouri awarded $177 million against a major hotel chain after one of its contracted security guards sexually assaulted a guest in her hotel room. The guard had a documented history of arrests for sexual misconduct that a thorough background check would have caught. The company had also failed to properly supervise him and was found to have obstructed the police investigation afterward. That verdict, $28 million in compensatory damages and $149 million in punitive damages, was upheld on appeal, $177 million. Think back to the contract we started with, worth just over $1 million a year, with $2 to $4 an hour in actual profit. A single judgment like that isn't a bad quarter. It's an extinction event for almost any security company that isn't one of the very largest in the world, and the fallout doesn't stop at the verdict itself. After a claim like this, insurance premiums for that company, and often for the entire industry in that region, go up sharply. Some smaller operators simply become uninsurable, which in most jurisdictions means they legally cannot operate at all. So how do the largest companies in this industry, the ones you've probably seen guarding airports and stadiums, survive an environment this financially hostile? Mostly through scale, and mostly by taking on enormous debt to buy that scale. One of the largest private security companies in North America carries a debt load exceeding $10 billion, with more than $10 billion of that debt coming due in the next few years. Its leverage, meaning how much debt it carries relative to its yearly earnings, sits at roughly 8 times, which credit rating agencies consider a highly leveraged speculative position, similar to a company living paycheck to paycheck, just at a scale of billions instead of thousands. That company still deals with guard turnover above 70% a year, even with all of its size and resources. Scale didn't eliminate the underlying instability of this business. It just moved that instability from the level of daily payroll stress up to the level of billion-dollar bond markets. Compare that to a different strategy. One of the largest security companies in Europe made a deliberate decision to walk away from low-margin, purely manual guarding contracts, and instead spent over $3 billion acquiring an electronic security company, one that specializes in access control, alarm systems, and commercial monitoring technology. That single acquisition helped push the parent company's overall profit margin above levels it had been stuck under for roughly a decade. In other words, the fastest way for a security giant to become more profitable wasn't hiring more guards. It was buying fewer of them and buying more cameras instead. Private security contracts typically lock in prices for 3 to 5 years at a time. That sounds stable, until you remember that wages don't stay flat for 3 to 5 years. Between roughly 2021 and 2024, average hourly wages for security guards in the United States rose from around $17 an hour to roughly $21 an hour. If your contract locked in a bill rate years earlier, without a clause allowing you to raise prices as wages rise, you are now legally obligated to keep paying rising wages while collecting a fixed aging price from the client. Your already thin margin doesn't shrink. It goes negative, and it stays that way until the contract ends. Recessions hit this industry unevenly. Office buildings and construction sites cut security spending fast when times get tight because that spending feels optional to them. Hospitals, data centers, and critical infrastructure sites tend to keep their security budgets, or even increase them, because for them, security spending never felt optional in the first place. A company that built its entire client base around office towers and construction sites is exposed to the next downturn in a way a company with hospitals and data centers on its client list simply isn't. All of this brings us to the more uncomfortable question sitting underneath everything else. If guarding is this expensive, this legally dangerous, and this thin on margin, why would the industry keep going in this direction at all? It isn't. Here's the math that's quietly reshaping the entire business. Staffing a single post around the clock every day of the year doesn't just require one guard. Covering all 168 hours in a week, accounting for vacation, sick time, and mandatory training, actually requires hiring roughly 5.5 full-time guards for that one single post. Paying for that level of round-the-clock human coverage typically costs a client somewhere between $140,000 and $280,000 a year for one location. A remote video monitoring system covering that same location, after the initial equipment cost, typically runs a client somewhere between $12,000 and $30,000 a year. That's a reduction in cost of 60 to 90%, while often improving how fast a threat is actually detected, since a camera doesn't need a bathroom break and doesn't fall asleep at 4 in the morning. That gap is simply too large for the industry to ignore forever. Companies that get ahead of this shift aren't selling guard hours anymore. They're selling a guarantee, something close to an insurance product, where the client pays a premium for confidence that nothing will go wrong, rather than paying for a visible body standing at a door. That said, cameras have limits that matter. In a hospital emergency room, in a psychiatric facility, at a nightclub door, or on an executive protection detail, the value isn't detection, it's judgment and physical presence in the moment something is escalating. No camera talks someone down from a fight. That part of the industry isn't disappearing. It's simply becoming the expensive, specialized core of the business, surrounded by an outer layer that's being steadily automated away. Let's put real numbers on what owning a mid-sized guarding company might look like. Assuming everything goes reasonably well, say your company holds contracts worth roughly $10 million a year in total billings, a mix of retail sites, warehouses, and a couple of corporate offices. Assume your realistic operating margin lands at the healthier end of what we discussed earlier, around 8%, meaning careful cost control, low turnover that year, and no major incidents. That leaves you with roughly $800,000 in operating profit for the year, before any debt payments, before any owner's compensation, before taxes. That's a genuinely good year. It's also a year where nothing went seriously wrong, no lawsuit, no rapid wage spike outpacing your contracts, no client loss to an underbidding competitor. Now the realistic version. Say wage inflation pushes your loaded labor cost up by roughly 10% over the course of the year on contracts that you can't reprice until renewal. Say one of your 10-guard contracts experiences 3 separate no-show nights that require emergency overtime coverage at 1.5 times the normal rate. Say turnover across your workforce runs at the industry typical rate, forcing you to spend heavily on recruiting and onboarding replacements who, statistically, have a real chance of quitting again within 90 days. Run that same $10 million book of business through those realistic conditions, and that 8% margin doesn't just shrink to 5 or 6%. It's plausible for it to fall to 2%, or to slip into an outright loss for the year, somewhere in the range of negative $100,000 to negative $200,000, depending on how bad the turnover and overtime problems get. The difference between the good year and the realistic year isn't a rounding error. It's the difference between an $800,000 profit and a $200,000 loss. On the exact same $10 million in contracts, that $1 million swing is the entire private security industry in a single sentence. The mistake almost everyone makes when they look at this industry from the outside is assuming the product is the guard. It isn't. The actual product being sold is a reduction in someone else's risk, a lower insurance premium, fewer lawsuits, the ability for a property manager to tell their own boss that the site is covered. The companies that struggle in this industry aren't struggling because nobody wants their services. They're struggling because they confuse a signed contract with actual profit, because they underprice the true cost of labor, because they underestimate exactly how expensive a single bad hire can become in a courtroom, and because they let cash flow timing quietly bleed them out while the income statement still looks fine. The companies that thrive aren't the ones with the most guards on payroll. They're the ones that figured out how to sell certainty itself, whether that's through better screening, better technology, or simply refusing to bid on a contract they know can't be run profitably. In an industry built entirely on preventing bad things from happening, the most successful businesses are the ones that stopped selling hours and started selling